Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from New York. My name is Abigail Greenleaf, and I am a public health demographer at ICAP at Columbia University. Thank you for joining today. I'm looking forward to give this talk about cell phone surveys in sub-Saharan Africa. For the past 5 years, I have worked on cell phone surveys in Burkina Faso, Niger, Uganda, Bangladesh, and Tanzania. There should be time, about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the presentation to ask questions. So please enter your questions in the chat box or Q&A, and my colleague Rachel Bray will monitor questions and collect them for me at the end of the talk. To note, this presentation and recording will be posted on ICAP's website, and in the notes section, you'll have a full citation for each of the studies or reports listed on the slide. So if interested, you can look into further details of the study there. I'm going to turn my video off until the question and answer portion of this presentation. Great. By the end of this talk, I hope you'll be able to evaluate whether a cell phone survey will help you answer your research question. In particular, I will discuss if the sample you are reaching with a cell phone survey will reflect your target population. And before I discuss the theory, I'd like to give an overview on cell phone ownership in sub-Saharan Africa. From what I could find, the first cell phone call took place in Democratic Republic of Congo in 1987. In the 30 years or so since, cell phone ownership in sub-Saharan Africa has skyrocketed. As you can see in the graph on the left, in 2012, there were just under 300 million cell phone owners. And in 5 years from now, in 2025, we'll have over twice as many cell phone owners. Urbanization, increased mobile network coverage, and decreased cell phone costs have contributed to the rapid increase in the number of cell phone owners throughout the continent, providing an opportunity to reach a large population by phone for data collection. The best measure of the number of unique cell phone owners in a population is mobile phone penetration rate, defined on the slide. West Africa currently has the highest mobile phone penetration rate, and Central Africa the lowest. Sub-Saharan Africa will continue to be the region with the fastest growing cell phone ownership, with a compound annual growth rate of 4.6%. But the era of rapid increases of phone ownership is waning. The compound annual growth rate in sub-Saharan Africa was in the double digits at the beginning of the decade. However, it is now half the previous level. Nonetheless, sub-Saharan Africa will add an additional 167 million subscribers between 2019 and 2025, resulting in an estimated 50% overall mobile penetration rate. Future cell phone ownership growth will be among the rural and young people, as the young age structure in many countries will result in large numbers of young consumers becoming adults and owning a mobile phone for the first time. This segment of the population will account for the majority of new subscribers. These young people are called digital natives, a person born or brought up during the age of digital technology and therefore familiar with computers and the internet from an early age. These digital natives will significantly influence mobile usage patterns in the future. The growth of cell phone ownership over the next few years is differential by country, with half of new subscribers coming from 5 countries. Among these 5 countries, 1 in 5 new subscribers will come from Nigeria, and approximately 1 in 8 from Ethiopia and 1 in 8 from DRC. So a transition from face-to-face to cell phone surveys raises concerns of survey quality, including representativeness and measurement errors, and the evidence has begun to address this. The first report of phone surveys in sub-Saharan Africa that I know of was in Tanzania amongst cotton farmers. They were called using a live interviewer. The World Bank shortly thereafter ran panel surveys in a number of countries by enrolling participants face-to-face and then giving them a cell phone and solar charger. The World Bank now has a useful how-to publication about enrolling respondents during a face-to-face survey, then calling them back for a panel with a live interviewer. Both the study in Tanzania and by the World Bank enrolled known participants. This is in contrast to random digit dial, where the participants are called at random and asked to participate. The first example I know that used a random digit dial approach to sample was a study in Cote d'Ivoire looking at HIV using live interviewers. The first reported random digit dial IVR was in 4 countries managed by the Center for Global Development. Both studies found men, the educated, and urban populations were overrepresented. As interest was increasing in cell phone surveys, a former colleague of mine conducted a literature review to identify all the population-based phone surveys in low and middle income countries. He found very little published on population-based mobile phone surveys in LMIC, only 10 articles, of which 9 used live interviewers to call respondents. I used the same primary inclusion criteria as my colleague, but asked a different research question for another literature review. I wanted to identify articles that compared modes of data collection in LMIC, and one of the modes had to be remote since I was interested in cell phone surveys. 9 of the 10 articles I found had been published between 2011 and 2014, signifying the recency of the body of research. I'll talk about this review again in a few more slides. In the meantime, I would like to talk about the 3 modes of cell phone data collection. The first mode I'd like to talk about is SMS. Generally, at the beginning of an SMS survey, the respondent receives a text message that briefly explains the purpose of the study, asks the respondent to choose a language to receive the future text messages in, which is a way of opting into the survey. If opted in, the respondent will then receive more texts, all of which are 160 characters or less. The respondent may be asked to respond with a number or by writing letters or words. Moving to the strengths of this approach, we see that the process is automated, so very few to no field survey staff are needed for the process. After receiving the text message, the respondent can answer at any time, which is in contrast to modes that require immediate response, like a phone call. Key weaknesses of SMS include the need to be able to read, and certain populations are not comfortable texting despite owning a phone. Or even if someone does read a text, they may not know how to write text or to use their keypad to respond. And a few more notes on SMS. This is an approach to data collection that I won't include in the rest of this presentation, as I think its use is very specific. Pew found that people under 34 were more likely to text in 6 sub-Saharan African countries than their counterparts 35 years and older. SMS research a few years ago in Ghana, Uganda, and Nigeria had very low response rates. And in Nigeria, for example, the SMS overrepresented the population with a post-secondary education by 50 percentage points. The author of the study concluded that population SMS surveys cannot replace face-to-face surveys. However, there are some countries where texting is a more known, comfortable mode of communication. If you're interested in learning about texting for data collection in sub-Saharan Africa, I would suggest looking at the literature coming from South Africa and Kenya. Certainly follow up with known populations that report comfort with texting as possible, but again, the rest of this presentation will not address SMS. The second mode I'd like to discuss is interactive voice response. Interactive voice response, IVR, is an automated audio survey. Respondents hear a pre-recorded question and respond by pressing the number that corresponds to the answer on their phone keypad. For example, a respondent will hear the question, "What is your gender?" For female, press 1. For male, press 2. To repeat this question, press 9. The respondent does not press 1, 2, or 9. The question will repeat once or twice before the survey is terminated. IVR surveys in sub-Saharan Africa are usually recorded by people rather than computer-generated audio. The top left picture is a recording studio in Burkina Faso where an IVR survey was recorded. An adaptation to IVR is called hybrid IVR. The interviewer consents the respondent, explains IVR, then transfer the respondent to the IVR survey itself. With colleagues, I chose to do this for a follow-up phone survey in Burkina Faso because we thought that IVR itself would be too challenging for the population where literacy is low. Strengths and weaknesses of IVR are similar to SMS, with the main difference being that respondents don't need to read, but they do need some numeric literacy to respond with their keypads. Finally, during a CADI approach, live interviewers administer a questionnaire verbally. CADI interviewers should speak the main languages in a country. Traditionally, interviewers work from a call center, but increasingly from home due to COVID-19. CADI doesn't require literacy. There is a higher response rate than IVR or SMS it is more difficult to say no to a live interviewer compared to an automated system where you just don't respond or hang up. You can ask more complex questions since the interviewer can explain any questions about the questions. The weaknesses are that you need to hire, train, and supervise interviewers, and data collection is more labor intensive than simply sending an IVR SMS from a computer system. So to wrap up this section on modes, I would like to discuss a few articles that have been published since a literature review I published in 2017. The 3 articles found that CADI produced a more representative sample than IVR that have all come out in the last 3 years. Cost analysis results are interesting as well and differ by country. In Nigeria, CADI was the most expensive, followed by IVR and SMS. However, in Burkina Faso, for work that I was involved in, we found that because CADI had a higher response rate, about 50% response compared to 20% for hybrid IVR, the CADI interview was significantly faster than IVR as well. So the cost per completed interview was substantially less for CADI. The hybrid IVR was longer for 2 reasons. First, at the beginning of the survey, after consenting the respondent, the interviewer explained IVR, which was not easy to do and took some time. The second reason was that the IVR survey took longer, the actual IVR automated portion itself, because the speed at which the questions were asked is slower in IVR compared to CADI. Since IVR is a recording and the respondent needs time to process and has no ability to ask questions, the IVR questions are asked fairly slowly and can be repeated. Both the CADI and hybrid IVR had 20 questions. And just to note, the average length of a CADI interview was 6 minutes. Most of the questions were yes, no. I was really astounded at how quickly the CADI interviewers could move through the questions. So before I discuss the 3 main applications of cell phone surveys for data collection in sub-Saharan Africa, I will note that there is robust literature to improve medical adherence and to send appointment reminders or conduct behavior change interventions, mostly relating to HIV. However, that's not data collection in terms of intentional collection, so those topics aren't included in this presentation. So moving to how phones can directly collect data. Phones have been an important part of surveillance, with WHO giving cell phones to health facilities to call up higher level facilities for integrated disease surveillance and response for some time. Applications of more advanced technology for surveillance include automating weekly calls with community health workers in Niger. These community health workers used IVR to signal weekly reports of polio, measles, and 2 animal diseases, PPR and rabies. Amongst populations, during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, there were SMS surveys to surveil the population, and they used an existing sample frame. There is interest from the chronic disease community to use cell phones to track chronic disease. And although outside of sub-Saharan Africa, a study in Bangladesh asked participants to call in when a member of the household had diarrhea in hopes of reducing recall error. Phones are a great way to follow up to conduct monitoring and evaluation with a known group. Participants are often enrolled in healthcare settings and are called to track the impact of an intervention. And finally, I don't share examples of surveys because the rest of the presentation will highlight plenty of work. But as noted on the slide, there are 2 main attributes of a cell phone survey to keep in mind: the mode of data collection and the sampling approach. I will talk through both shortly. So getting a little bit more into the theory, I want to talk about total survey error. In order to operationalize survey quality, survey methodologists devise the concept of total survey error. Total survey error is a framework that describes the accumulation of errors that may arise in the design, collection, processing, and analysis of a survey. Total survey error is often divided into measurement and representation errors. In this presentation, I will focus on representation errors. I want to include a working example to make sure the concepts are clear, and the working example I'm suggesting are tigers. Let's say we are conducting a survey amongst tigers. In case you haven't heard, tigers are susceptible to COVID-19. The target group is the group about whom you want to create inferences, and it is important that group is clearly defined. My target population is all tigers in Thailand. What a tongue twister. According to Google, there are 250 tigers in Thailand. I want to survey all the tigers in Thailand to find out if they have changed their behavior to reduce the spread of COVID-19. My research question is on the slide. So bear with me, I know this is a text and definition laden slide, but getting these concepts clearly defined will provide a platform for more useful conversation about these topics. So I just explained a target population. The next concept is a sample frame. On the right, you will see that we have all the tigers from the target population in our sample frame, which means there is no exclusion or erroneous inclusion in our frame. We didn't accidentally slip in any tigers from any other countries. This is what you want. You want a perfect match of a target population in a frame. If there are 100,001 people in your target population, you want 100,001 people in your sample frame, no more, no less. However, a perfect match of a target population and sample frame is rare. When additional people are included or people are excluded from your sample frame, you have coverage error. There are 4 types of coverage error, but in cell phone surveys, we are most concerned with undercoverage, which is when people in the target population are not on the sample frame. To be more specific about undercoverage related to cell phones, we need to figure out who does and does not have a cell phone, because if you do not have a cell phone, you will not be on the sample frame. So let's learn a little bit more about who does and does not own cell phones in sub-Saharan Africa. Once you have an idea of who your target population is, I would recommend either using survey or industry sources to estimate what percentage of your target population owns a cell phone, so you can estimate undercoverage. This list of 4 surveys isn't necessarily exhaustive, but gives you an idea of what population-based estimates are available, including sources from FIA, where I work at ICAP, Demographic and Health Surveys, PMA 2020 at Johns Hopkins, and Afrobarometer. There are 2 organizations that collect cell phone ownership data from mobile network operators and governments. GSMA is an industry organization that represents the interests of mobile network operators worldwide. International Telecommunications Union is a specialized agency of the United Nations that is responsible for issues that concern information and communication technologies. ITU's data is nicely visualized on the World Bank website. So based on the reports and research I've seen from the past 5 years, there are some characteristics fairly consistent with phone ownership. Ownership varies by age and by gender. Young men are more likely than all age groups to own a phone, but young women, particularly those under age 20, are less likely than their older counterparts. Oldest age groups have less ownership than middle age groups, regardless of gender. Overall, more men than women own cell phones, and the more educated a person is, the more likely they are to own a cell phone. And I have found thus far that urban populations are more likely to own a cell phone than rural populations. A couple more points about phone ownership worth mentioning. The distinction between ownership and access matters. A disproportionate percent of survey respondents of research in Mozambique were phone owners, meaning that people who access but don't own phones are harder to get a hold of. The question of how does one account for people who own multiple cell phones often comes up, and there's a good article by Alan Lebrique that talks about this and quantifies statistically what it looks like for people to own multiple cell phones and debunks the myth that this is going to be a large issue in sampling. In Burkina Faso, among phone owners, 83% had only 1 phone number, and the average number of cell phone numbers among owners was 1.2. Finally, it is important to note that as cell phone ownership increases in a country, the more representative a phone survey will be of the underlying population. This is because a greater proportion of your target population will be included on your sample frame. I want to talk specifically now about women and cell phone ownership to help people understand the profile of female phone owners and how they interact with their phones. A really interesting recently published article from Tanzania provides good ideas of questions to ask during a face-to-face survey about phone ownership. Find out how often participants use their phone, and do they share the phone or use it themselves? It's important to clarify individual ownership from household ownership. For example, in Burkina Faso, 86% of households reported ownership, whereas only 47% of women did. The study in Burkina also found that the sociodemographic profile of owners and non-owners was different. as did a study in Nigeria where women who did not have a phone had half the odds of using modern contraception compared to women who did own a phone. GSMA publishes a gender gap report about every 2 years, and they listed 3 barriers to mobile phone ownership for women in sub-Saharan Africa. The first 2 were the same for men, affordability and literacy and skills. However, the third reason that women didn't own cell phones was that their family didn't approve, whereas for men, the third barrier was network coverage. So we're going to talk about 3 additional sources of representation error, but in my opinion, coverage error probably is the greatest cause of representation error. If you're going to do a cell phone survey, I suggest you take the time before you begin a study to compare the profile of phone owners and non-owners to see and try to quantify how substantial the gap is between the 2 groups. Be sure to stratify by gender because the demographics of phone owners differ by gender. Know that representativeness increases as phone ownership does, but as mentioned earlier, phone ownership growth is slowing. There's increasing literature pointing to the ways that cell phone owners are distinct from non-owners and in ways other than just basic demographic characteristics. Recent research from Rakai in Uganda has explored sexual health behavior and cell phone ownership. In conclusion, for this type of the first of 4 errors, phone owners and non-owners are quite different, particularly among women. There are ways to try to reach the non-cell phone owner. You can try to get someone that picks up to pass the phone, but this is kind of unwieldy and hard to know and who to pass it to and how to make that still a probability sample. You can certainly, if enrolling face-to-face, try to give the respondent a phone. There's also an option called the half interval open that was used in household surveys, but again, these are harder to implement over the phone. So moving on to sampling. Interviewing the whole population is often too time-consuming and expensive, so once you have your list of who's in your target population, you need to select a sample. Sampling is the process of selecting a subset of observations from an entire population of interest so that the characteristics from the subset can be used to draw conclusions or make inferences about an entire population. In our tigers example, we have systematically selected every second tiger at a safe distance. I will now discuss the 2 main approaches to selecting respondents for a phone survey. So random digit dial is a technique to randomly select phone numbers to call. In sub-Saharan Africa, there's no list or frame of phone numbers to select from. The researcher must identify all 2-digit prefixes in the country, then randomly generate the remaining 6 to 7 numbers to create phone numbers. Rather than trying to explain this process in detail during this presentation, I have a reference on the slide, Gibson 2017, that explains this process for those that are interested. Creating the phone numbers at random means a great number of phone numbers that don't exist or haven't been assigned to someone end up being called, a system that's fairly inefficient. In rare occasions, a mobile network operator will give a list of active phone numbers, but my understanding is this list is difficult and expensive to obtain. Companies such as Geopol or Viamo that run cell phone surveys in Africa now have lists of phone numbers of participants who previously responded to surveys and have consented to be contacted again, creating a list of valid phone numbers that could be sampled from. If you're going to do a random digit dial, I think there are a few considerations. If 80% of the phone market share in a country is MTN, for example, you would want 80% of the phone numbers you would call to start with an MTN prefix. In Tanzania, the World Bank found that those using the premium network responded significantly more than those using other networks. Quotas are one way to try to ensure your respondent group isn't just urban or male. I'll talk about quotas more in a moment. The RDD studies I know of have mostly used IVR because so many phone numbers have to be called due to lack of a sample frame, and it's really unwieldy to do a live interviewer. However, with colleagues at PMA 2020, I worked on a random digit dial study in Burkina Faso that used PADI to call women. 20 interviewers who I feature in the photo on the right because their undertaking was a huge task and they did a wonderful job. They had to call 42,000 phone numbers to get 2,325 female respondents. As you see on the slide, 72% of calls that were picked of the 72% of the 42,000 calls that were picked up were men. We did use quota groups. We had 4 groups, urban and rural, and then women 15 to 19 and 20 to 49. The urban quota groups, the 2 urban quota groups filled up first. The 20 to 49 rural group filled up third. Then to enroll enough rural women 15 to 19, we ended up having to place about 30 calls that were picked up to reach 1 young rural respondent. We ended up having as many urban women that picked up that we couldn't interview because their quota group was full as we did in our final sample. So we had over 2,000 urban women that were otherwise eligible, but their quota group was full. It was a huge undertaking. So I want to now move to another sampling method, which is following up to a face-to-face survey. As mentioned earlier, enrolling respondents face-to-face, then following up with a phone call is how cell phone surveys began in sub-Saharan Africa. However, recent studies I've seen haven't given face-to-face respondents who don't own a cell phone, which was an earlier practice. The face-to-face survey serves as your sample frame, and although face-to-face enrollment is more costly than random digit dial, it should produce a more representative sample. When calculating how many people to sample from your face-to-face survey, you have to figure out how much non-contact you'll have. In other words, how many people won't pick up your calls, akin to a vacancy rate in a household survey, but these phone vacancies will be a much higher % than household vacancies. Also, you need to think about how many people will refuse your survey, which again will probably be higher than a face-to-face, but depends a little bit on the context. So in conclusion, random digit dial is difficult to get a representative sample. As seen on the slide, for years, people have concluding that if a target population has low cell phone ownership and the aim is to create a representative sample, RDD is not suitable. In Burkina Faso, we needed about another week to complete data collection to reach our quota of young female rural respondents. However, if you're looking to reach urban populations or a highly educated group, RDD could be a good approach. Face-to-face enrollment requires time and money for the in-person survey, but can be a great way to track trends over time if enough of your respondents own cell phones. Finally, just to note another approach to sampling, and I'm sure there'll be new approaches coming out. The World Bank during the Ebola crisis in Liberia and Sierra Leone collaborated with institutions such as ministries, unions, religious orgs, universities, and other projects that had databases of phone numbers of members to create a sample frame. Moving to our third type of error, once you have selected your sample, you contact respondents. Some will complete your survey and others won't. If those who complete your survey are different from those who do complete your survey, you may have error or even bias if completion is correlated to the outcome of interest. Generally, non-response in telephone surveys stems from 3 areas. First, failure to contact sampled respondents. Second, refusal to participate. And third, health or language limitations. I will share a slide on each of these topics. So the reasons that a person may not pick up a cell phone survey in sub-Saharan Africa differs from high-income regions. First, because the cost of placing a call is significantly less expensive if you call someone with the same mobile network operator as you, many people have a SIM card for each mobile network operator and swap their SIM cards in and out of their phones to save money. This is in contrast to those of us in the US who have the same phone number at all times and call across networks. Next, in areas where electricity is inconsistent, cell phones lose their charge and are thus turned off. In rural areas, particularly where cell phone service is non-existent or inconsistent, the respondent doesn't have service, so they can't receive the call. It's difficult to quantify non-contact in an RDD survey because distinguishing the difference between phone numbers that exist and phone numbers that have not yet been assigned to a person is difficult. But in a follow-up survey, you can try to figure out non-contact from non-respondents from non-phone owners. In Mozambique, there was 80% non-contact. This list was not from a face-to-face survey, it was an administrative list, so that's pretty high. In Burkina Faso, I did a follow-up phone survey with colleagues, and we had 43% non-contact in 1 year, and I think that was particularly high because it was just women. It would be lower if men were included. So the second cause of non-response is refusal. You can actually have an appreciable impact on refusal by training your interviewers well. A group at Johns Hopkins has been investigating how incentives, the introduction of the survey, and the modality impact response rates. In my experience with phone surveys, I found that the majority of refusals happen before the interviewer can actually get to consent. Because the respondents ask many questions as listed on the right of the slide before the interviewer can get to consent, refusal usually happens in the first couple of minutes. We see that refusal rates in the recent past for RDD and face-to-face follow-up, CADI and IVR are all around or below 10%. So the third cause of non-response is language or health issues. And I'd like to talk about language fractionalization. So addressing CADI first, you'll need to hire interviewers that reflect the language makeup of your respondents. That may mean, like the experience I had in Burkina was we had one interviewer who spoke a minority language who ended up having very little work just because so few respondents picked up those calls. Turning to IVR, the first question the respondent should hear when they pick up is which language do you prefer? For English, press 1, for Hausa, press 2, and so on. The order languages are offered in matters. In Burkina Faso, when a lesser spoken language for full day was offered first during an IVR, it was chosen 3 times more than when offered last. I hypothesize this happens because respondents may choose the first language in which they felt comfortable, even if it isn't the language that they are most comfortable in. They hear, they can speak a little bit of whatever language, and because this is a new experience, they go ahead and just pick that. And then I think that tends to be higher drop off throughout the survey. Studies from Zimbabwe and Ethiopia found that the majority language was chosen more often than expected, which may be because minority language speakers have lower mobile penetration rates than majority speakers, but authors were only able to offer but not confirm that hypothesis. So wrapping up non-response, we see that it's difficult to distinguish coverage error from non-response error. And you can't do that easily with random digit dial, but it is possible with face-to-face follow-up. There are approaches to comparing respondents and non-respondents, such as comparing phone owners and non-owners using DHS, census, or other administrative data. And one approach to looking at response and non-response bias or error in some high-income countries has been comparing early and late respondents. For a phone survey in Burkina Faso that I worked on, we found that survey respondents differed from non-respondents for both modes, CADI and hybrid IVR, but there was greater sample distortion for hybrid IVR, which makes sense since hybrid IVR is more cognitively demanding and that the respondent needs to understand the question, retrieve the right response, and then enter it in the keypad, whereas for CADI, they just need to retrieve the right response and orally verbally share it. So I want to talk a little bit about response rates in the US. The random dial response rates, as I last saw, are about 9%. They're difficult in the low and middle income countries to standardize because, again, knowing the difference between a non-working number and a call that isn't picked up is not easy to discern because mobile network operators don't have great outcome codes. There's an article by Charles Lau about this that is trying to help standardize this portion of research, which is greatly appreciated. But generally, you're going to have a higher response rate for CADI than IVR and for face-to-face follow-up than random digit dial. I want to make one more point about non-response. Traditionally, response rates have been used to gauge non-response error and survey quality, but a high non-response rate does not necessarily translate to a biased estimate if the propensity to respond is not correlated with the outcome of interest. Non-response bias occurs when people who are sampled but don't complete the survey systematically differ from those who successfully complete regarding the outcome of interest. So I think a lot of people focus on response rates, but really more valuable than the response rate is looking at response bias. Again, the comparison of those who responded and didn't respond and what you would expect both groups' outcome of interest to be. So some tips here about information you can try to collect about respondents so that you can quantify some non-response. Moving to our last form of error, which is post-adjustment error. When post-adjustments do not account for representation errors, and when post adjustments to account for representation errors do not improve the accuracy of the survey estimate, you have post adjustment error. In our example here, you see that tigers number 2 and 10 were upweighted, and tiger number 6 downweighted, and tiger 8 had no additional weights. So these results are really interesting. And the first example I share is from Nigeria and is not actually a health survey. It was about voting was the main outcome of interest, but because there are so few articles I've seen that do actually try to weight the survey, the phone survey, I wanted to include it. A random digit dial survey done in Nigeria comparing IVR and SMS with DHS results found that weighting did not improve the estimate of voting. In fact, the estimates were barely changed, and the IVR weighted was actually even farther away from the true value than the IVR unweighted. In Burkina Faso, the random digit dial that I've spoken about, we compared women with a concurrent face-to-face survey. So the face-to-face full sample estimate of modern contraceptive use, which we consider to be the gold standard, was 26% contraceptive use. We thought, gosh, maybe if we limit the sample to only those who own phones, which inherently are the only people that could answer our cell phone survey, maybe the face-to-face estimate will be closer to the random digit dial. So when only looking at phone owners, which again are the people that were in the sample frame for our random digit dial, we saw that modern contraceptive use was approximately 32%. However, both the random digit dial weighted and unweighted estimates were far above the actual value. In fact, 14 percentage points overestimation of modern contraceptive use, which remains substantial and significant even after including our post-stratification rates of age, education, and residence. I looked quite a bit into what might have been causing this and never came up with a hypothesis that I could defend. So wrapping up, this presentation has highlighted some challenges of phone surveys in sub-Saharan Africa, and I want to enumerate what I see as the biggest challenges to creating a valid survey statistic. In countries where phone ownership is low, drawing inferences about the general population from a phone survey is inadvisable because phone owners are different from non-owners, with the main sociodemographic characteristics of owners listed in point 1. Second, we're beginning to see that it is beyond just basic sociodemographics, that there's an increasing body of literature about how cell phones impact public health choices, with the hypothesis that exposure to messages that are received through a cell phone and wider networks, due to being able to call people, change behavior. This is important to consider and could be a cause of why the post adjustments didn't work in the work I did in Burkina, but we don't know yet. My experience in Burkina Faso was that quotas help improve random digit dial representativeness, but they're very difficult to implement. Countries where there is more gender equity in cell phone ownership could better handle gender quotas. As mentioned many times, differentiating phone owners from non-owners and non-respondents is difficult. Where we can intervene is reducing refusal rates, and there's increasing research in that area. The good news from the survey of tigers in Thailand was that it was representative, and we found that the vast majorities of tigers are taking precautions such as wearing a face mask to reduce the spread of COVID-19. And despite the warnings I have given throughout this presentation, I think that cell phone surveys in certain circumstances can be a valid source of information with the right circumstances. So I'd like to share some of those circumstances on the next slide. As a public health practitioner, I know that we acknowledge that populations take risky behaviors and we try to mitigate risk. So for example, in reproductive health, we encourage people to practice safe sex. In the same vein, I would like to encourage everyone to practice safe surveys. Here are some tips how. If you can be very explicit about who is in your respondent population, that will help. Don't just say 85% of respondents from a random digit dial think COVID-19 is a threat to their health. Resist the urge to not explicitly address who responded. Say 85% of respondents, of whom 75% were male, think COVID-19 is a threat to their health. Otherwise, you're going to be making claims that don't actually represent the underlying population. Using APOR disposition codes, which if you Google APOR disposition codes, you can find, helps create standard survey outcomes like refusal and contact rates so that we can better compare across studies. The early literature that I reviewed in my literature review didn't include these, but I see more and more often the APOR outcomes are being included, and it really helps compare across modes, countries, and topics. Thus far, the literature shows that CADI creates a more representative sample than IVR, and although CADI can be more expensive in certain situations, I think if possible, it's worth the cost. The face-to-face follow-up is preferred over random digit dial, and I've found good experience. Many of the countries that FIA works in Southern Africa have pretty high cell phone ownership rates, over 70%, so those are great places to do a follow-up phone survey. And finally, I got into phone surveys because many people, I'm interested in new technology and taking risks. We have to find the balance between, using exciting new approaches and getting too far ahead of the science. I think that countries in Sub-Saharan Africa that have a fair amount of ownership should continue to try random digit dial, but with caution. I'm excited about follow-up phone surveys. First with CADI and then trying out IVR. There's a lot of exciting research, particularly coming out of South Africa about mixed modes. We've tried mixing modes with CADI to hybrid IVR in Burkina Faso, but continuing to mix those will be interesting. Finally, I imagine research on WhatsApp, in particular for texting surveys, will become a popular topic in the coming years. There's been a lot of research in the last year and a half, and Survey CTO and JPAL have a really nice conglomeration of resources on their websites that they put together over the past few months in light of COVID-19, and I would suggest checking these resources out. And it's time for questions. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I wish all of you continued mental, physical health during this time. Thank you to my ICAP colleagues who helped prepare the presentation. Rachel, any questions?
Oh my goodness, Abba, we have so many good questions. So Samuel Batong is asking, what informs the decision to do phone interviews as opposed to face-to-face interviews?
It's a good question. I think it would start with your research question. What are you trying to find out and who are you trying to contact? So again, I would look first at phone ownership levels in the country or area where you want to try to conduct a survey. That would be the first step if I was trying to figure out which mode to use, whether face-to-face or phone.
We also have a question from Zachary on how do you compare credibility of responses between an in-person, face-to-face, and phone interviews?
Yeah, so figuring out reliability of responses is a good question. There is research that started face-to-face and followed up with phone, and what you want to do is include in your phone survey a couple of questions that were in the face-to-face. So you can say, okay, like for example, the research I did in Burkina Faso, we saw that 26% of women reported contraceptive use, but a much higher percent reported it via the phone. We don't know if that's measurement error or representation error. Look for some very simple questions like age. We found that age, when following up with our phone survey, was fairly reliable for CADI, but the IVR, it was less reliable. So really the best way to look at the reliability of a response from a phone survey is to compare it to a face-to-face, hopefully one within which your study is nested, or you can try to compare to the DHS, which is what the Nigeria voting survey did. They didn't have the voting data in their face-to-face survey, so they compared to DHS. But it is a good question, and you'll find that responses are more reliable with CADI than IVR.
Okay, moving into some more practical considerations, a few people have asked, how do you obtain informed consent when doing a phone survey?
My understanding is the best practice is abbreviated verbal consent, and there are like 3 to 4 aspects, which I don't know off the top of my head, that must be included. I think they're like the respondent must understand that participation is voluntary, like the objective of the study, and one or two other aspects. So you can't do a full informed consent on the phone. It would take too long and it wouldn't be well received. So abbreviated verbal consent, to my knowledge, is the best standard of practice. There is some literature from Joe Ali at Johns Hopkins University that has looked about ethics of phone surveys and consent. So I would suggest looking at that literature.
Okay, keeping with the idea of consent and also the related idea of privacy, how do you handle privacy issues, especially when mobile operators can't necessarily share their phone numbers with a third party?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question. In terms of privacy of phone numbers, there's different laws in each country. For example, in Burkina Faso, we were not able to get a list of phone numbers from mobile network operators, as that was not allowed. It was against the law, whereas in some countries it's possible. But I think that's all I can say about privacy.
Okay.
Question.
Yeah, thank you. And then also thinking about that as well, do you have any ideas of how to deal with phone sharing and how to ascertain identity if it's a follow-up and you need to reach a certain person associated with that cell phone number?
Yeah, that's a good question. We had to do that with our phone follow-up survey in Burkina Faso. We found that people were really helpful. Like if somebody else picked up the phone and we were asking for Aisha, people were curious about who was calling, what we wanted, but people were pretty helpful. We did not have a lot of people that were angry that we called or difficult. You know, one guy said, gosh, she's around the corner, call back in 10 minutes, or I can go get her. And I said, it's fine, we can call back. So we found that when sharing phones, you can ask for that person by name. And you know, I think sometimes the issue of lying comes up a lot more in cell phone surveys, but I don't think that it's any more lying than you would have in a face-to-face survey, potentially about like a household member. So we found that we were able to find people. And what we did was we talked about the salient event that would help the person on the phone perhaps link to the face-to-face survey. So in Burkina, it was that our female interviewers had tablets, and like that was a very distinguishing event within the interview. And so we'd say, oh yeah, we were the women that came to your house with the tablets. And then people would say, oh yeah, like I remember you were here like a year ago. And that would help them kind of click, and you could tell that they had participated. So, you know, people, I don't think that respond to cell phone surveys are looking to lie and pretend they're the wrong person. You know, there may be issues with multiple people having the same name in one household. One way to combat that is to have an approximate age, understanding that in some places, having an exact age isn't something that is valued or kept track of. So having a general idea can help of age can help identify someone if there's multiple names in a household.
Okay, thank you. Edna Pierre had a really interesting question. How does one account for non-response due to technical issues? For example, power issues or connectivity in some of these surveys?
Hi, Edna, that's a good question. Again, a big issue is we don't always know the cause of non-response. So whereas in my slides, I was able to break it down into 3 parts. A lot of the data that we get from mobile network operators is not reliable. It may say that the phone was out of service when in fact it was a known number that was turned off. And I don't have updates from the past 2 or 3 years about mobile networks in Africa, as I've been away from the space for a little bit. So maybe it's improved, but it's hard to know. Certainly if you have someone on the phone and they get cut off mid-interview, you don't know if it's because of service or power, or you know, usually during mid-interview, it's not because they're refusing. So I suggest having your interviewers call back, but it's hard to always know the exact reason for refusal. Unlike face-to-face, I think you get a little bit more data to work with.
There were also a couple of questions about speaking to the logistics of targeting specific populations. Like, let's say you want to do a phone survey to contact those with chronic illness. What would be some of the strategies that you would use to design that?
That's a good question. I think you would want to, again, start with a live interviewer, just because trying to, I think, ask particularly some questions about chronic diseases is hard for people that haven't been exposed to getting their blood pressure read or a diabetes test. So you really need that interviewer to be able to gauge, like, does the respondent understand what I'm asking about, or are they just kind of generally guessing if they have, diabetes, for example. So I would suggest having an interviewer conduct the phone survey, and if it's a random digit dial, you would need to go through your eligibility criteria. You need to do your abbreviated verbal consent, and then you could have, I think, some additional eligibility criteria. I'd have to think about whether or not you'd want your chronic disease eligibility criteria before or after the abbreviated verbal consent. But my experience is you want to build a little bit of rapport and trust with the respondent before you start asking really personal specific questions. Even asking about age in Burkina was a little bit prickly for people because we needed to ask for age for our quotas. So that was something that people kind of, before they understood kind of fully what was going on or why this was happening, they were hesitant to give personal information, which I think we can all relate to.
We also have received a couple of questions about the use of incentives in these surveys. Do you know of any incentives that have been used, and if so, where?
Yeah, I would suggest looking at the literature from the G4H project at Johns Hopkins with Justin Gibson and George Carrillo. They have done a lot of what they've called micro trials to look at they have randomized respondents who receive different types of incentives. I think it varies quite a bit by country. I think one important thing to keep in mind is what precedent are you setting, and what is, ethically appropriate. You don't want to give too much of an incentive, as we know, so that it's coercive, and you don't want to give such a high incentive that the next phone survey can't afford it and no one else can do it. But I will refer people to the literature and again, say it's very country specific. I've heard that in some countries, the incentive doesn't make a difference. In other countries, it makes a large difference. There's ways to send and survey. There's different incentive amounts. The project at Hopkins I mentioned looked at lottery, entering people into a lottery. There's a lot of different ways and to do incentives.
There's also a few really interesting questions from Nazi. How do you capture nonverbal cues in a CADI survey? And are there any suggestions or guidelines for interview length?
So nonverbals are obviously hard to capture. I think you need to train your interviewers to really listen carefully to the respondent and try to pick up on like I don't know what you would call them, like verbal, nonverbal cues, the sound of hesitancy, literally hesitating, and there's a lot of literature, I think, from high income countries about interviewers and how they interact with respondents. One interesting article I saw said that when interviewers match the pace of the conversation to the respondent, so like, for example, if the respondent is a little bit sleepy and is speaking more slowly, the interviewer is generally more successful in getting the respondent to complete, or on the other hand, speaking more quickly like the respondent. So there's research around that. Interview length is a good question. Most drop-off happens within the first few minutes of a call. So it's kind of like once you have someone on the phone, you can continue. I think if you're going to repeatedly call someone, you don't want to have a long call so that they're, unwilling to pick up in the future. So you need to keep that in mind. But as you saw on the slide, the CADI interview in Burkina was 6 minutes. Those 6 minutes flew by. I think you could have a respondent on the phone for longer. I think you could go up to 15 to 20 minutes, but again, weighing whether or not you're going to call that person back and if they're going to pick up a second time.
Okay, I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. It looks like it's 8:59. But just one last question. You talk about cell phone coverage and non-response and dealing with these things as you're conducting a survey. How do you account for these biases after the fact? Like, you've conducted a survey, like what are some of those strategies?
Yeah, that's what's tough. That's the fourth type of representation error, the post-adjustment error. You know, that's how you traditionally account for non-response and non-coverage, but we saw that that didn't work. So I think that's, you know, $1 million question and a great question to end on. Great, thank you, Rachel, and thank you again, everyone, for joining today. And oh, my contact is on this slide if there are any additional questions.